So I'm going to try to show you how little thought goes into American foreign policy. I'm just going to give you one example, but I think it's such a clear example that you will agree with me that whoever is running our foreign policy, so long as they're part of the American foreign policy establishment, they're not qualified to do it because the whole establishment is just incapable of thinking clearly about actual national interests and the interests of the world. Okay, so this example involves China and the chip war, which you've probably heard about. The US launched the so-called chip war against China, started in a small way in the Trump administration, was really ramped up by Biden pretty early on, and has gotten ramped up a second time just recently by Biden as kind of a parting shot. And the way the chip war works is that the US restricts the microchips that can enter China from the US and, for that matter, from various other countries, and also restricts the export of chip making equipment to China. So for the time being, China, is really operating at a handicap. They can't get the advanced chips. They don't readily import the equipment that would make them. They are, though, making pretty considerable strides, both in finding ways to use their equipment to design surprisingly impressive chips. And also, this has apparently provoked their companies to find new, more efficient ways to get more AI power out of less in the way of compute power. It looks like the long-term effect of this, like a few years out, is going to be just to give China a more robust indigenous infrastructure for making the most advanced chips than it would have had otherwise. So in the long run, this will probably make China stronger, but leave that aside. My point isn't that the policy itself is bad. My point is that there's an obvious consequence of this policy that has gotten no attention whatsoever. And here is the consequence I'm talking about. So before the US launched this chip war, here was the situation. Once upon a time, only a few years ago, both China and the US were getting very advanced microchips from a factory in Taiwan, which is the source of all the world's advanced microchips. Then, as a result of the so-called chip war launched by the US, these export restrictions that limit China's access both to advanced microchips and to the equipment you would need to manufacture them, suddenly China is no longer getting these advanced microchips from this factory in Taiwan. The US still is. The West still is. So there's suddenly this asymmetry in benefit from this factory. So before this happened, China had a very strong disincentive to invade Taiwan, which is that the factory would pretty much for sure be enduringly disabled, either blown up intentionally by the US if China took over the island, or if China took over the island, disabled in another way by a kind of remote control that we can do by virtue of the fact that the factory needs just constant tech support from the Netherlands, which makes this chip-making equipment that nobody else makes. So one way or another, China knows that war on Taiwan means no more advanced chips. At least it used to mean that. Doesn't mean it anymore, at least not for China. It still means that the US and the West don't get any more advanced chips. But that's a downside of war on Taiwan that no longer confronts China. So what was a strong deterrent to invasion by China is no longer there. So that obviously raises the chances of invasion. Maybe by little, maybe by a lot, who knows? My point is just that it's important enough to deserve consideration, and yet it has played zero role in the debate over the policy. In fact, there's been very little debate, but certainly this point has not been raised in any place of prominence, no op-ed pages, nothing. Okay, now you may ask, how do I know? Do I spend all day monitoring the media and the trade press and everything else? No, I don't. I'm not an expert on China. I'm not an expert on China and technology. However, a few months ago, I had on my podcast, the Non-Zero Podcast, a guy named Paul Triolo, a true expert, one of our leading experts on China and technology. He works at the consulting group Albright Stonebridge, which people pay tons of money to give them counsel about things exactly like this. He used to be at the Eurasia Group. And I said to him, in retrospect, what we had which was a TMC in Taiwan that both China and the West were heavily, heavily dependent on, was a pacifying force.
Absolutely. The Silicon Shield idea, which many people have criticized, it was maybe not in the way Taiwan views it as like it's preventing China, but it was a stabilizing factor. If Chinese companies are able to use Taiwan and they're heavily integrated with Taiwan, yes, that absolutely would act as a deterrence to China. And the problem is that people, again, aren't talking about, except for you and maybe me, is that all of these policies are undercutting that dependency.
This obvious, serious consequence of this policy gets no discussion. None of these, David Sanger, New York Times correspondent, writing about the Cold War and technology and superpowers. Does he mention it? I will pay $1,000 to anybody who can show me that he has mentioned this. Only the first person. Not everyone. I'm not going to lose more than $1,000 on this. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to lose anything, because it's just the kind of thought that doesn't occur to the entire American foreign policy establishment, broadly construed, people at think tanks, reporters, and so on. So this is, as I said, it's just one example, but it just seems to me to speak very powerfully about a great poverty in our foreign policy discourse that you almost certainly haven't heard anybody say this. I mean, you may have heard me say it. You may have heard Paul Triolo say it. I've been saying it a lot on podcasts and stuff, and I've said it in the Non-Zero newsletter. So one way or another, you may start hearing about it. I hope you do. But as of the recording date of this thing, which is mid-January 2025, it's gotten basically no attention. And I could go on and on about the American foreign policy establishment, say a lot of things. Almost none of them would be kind. As you can tell, I have a little bit of a bee in my bonnet about the U.S. foreign policy establishment, or as many of us call it, the blob. But I'll save all that for now and just leave it there. This is a clear-cut example of the U.S. not thinking stuff through. This little diatribe of mine obviously is not going to transform American foreign policy. If the foreign policy establishment were listening to me in the first place, our policy might be different. I'm just like this guy with a newsletter and podcast. But if you agree that this is kind of crazy, and people like you online, just while discussing things on social media, wherever, like bring this up, complain about it, whatever, the more people who talk about this stuff, the more likely it is that eventually someday, before we're all dead, enlightenment will dawn on the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and we will all happily just die of natural causes instead of like global nuclear war or something. Okay, so if this made sense to you, I hope you will consider subscribing to the Non-Zero newsletter, where we often do what I've just done, which is ask, like, wait a second, shouldn't somebody be talking about this thing that nobody's talking about? We do the same thing in the Non-Zero podcast. I hope you'll subscribe to that. And of course, rate and review us, smash the like button, and so on. Thanks for listening.